The first thing that tipped me off that morning wasn't Oppos. The usual low rumble of the cattle or the smell of damp earth rising from the valley. No, it was this neon flash of aggressive, plastic yellow cutting through the gray dawn light, just sitting there right where my driveway meets the county road like a punch to the gut. I remember standing there on the porch, my coffee still steaming in that chipped ceramic mug I've had for a decade, squinting at this bright yellow arrow sign that looked like it belonged at a construction site or a cheap garage sale. But instead, it was pointing straight at my locked ranch gate as if my private world had suddenly been declared an open market tourist attraction. I figured it was a prank. Maybe some kids from the high school 3 towns got bored and decided to mess with the, grumpy guy on the hill, So I finished my coffee, pulled on my boots, and hiked down there to tear out of the ground. But then my phone buzzed in my pocket with a notification that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was an automated email confirmation from an app I'd never heard of, a subject line that read, reservation confirmed, Blackwood Creek Ranch, listing a head count of 150 guests for a, professional networking summit, starting at 2 in the afternoon. And for a second, I honestly thought I was having a stroke, because I don't rent this place out, I don't host weddings, I don't do corporate retreats, I raise cattle, and I value the silence that most people are too scared to sit with for 5 minutes. I walked down to the gate and realized it wasn't Oppos. Just one sign. There was a whole breadcrumb trail of these neon yellow eyesores spaced out every 50 yards along the shoulder of the road, each one with bold black lettering that said, Realtor Caravan, checking ahead, And I felt this slow, hot crawl of anger starting at the base of my spine because someone had drawn a digital target on my front door without so much as a phone call. I was standing there, hand on the cold iron of my gate, when the first car pulled up, a shiny white SUV that looked far too clean for these back roads. And the woman inside rolled down her window, looking at her GPS, and then at me like I was a piece of the scenery she hadn't expected to see. She asked me, with this practiced, airy, professional tone, if this was the staging area for the, Hilltop Horizon tour, And when I told her she was on private property and there was no tour, she blinked at me, held up her phone, and showed me a digital map where a bright red pin was sitting right on my GPS coordinates, dead center on my gate. That's when it hit me that this wasn't Oppos. Just a mistake. It was a coordinated effort. Someone had gone into a system, mapped my land, and told 150 strangers that my ranch was the gateway to their afternoon payday, and I knew right then that I wasn't Oppos. Just looking at a misunderstanding, I was looking at an invasion. My neighbor, Silas, a man who's lived on the adjacent section since before the county even paved the roads, came rattling up in his old flatbed truck, leaning out the window with this crooked grin that usually meant he'd seen something I hadn't in Oppos. He pointed at the signs and told me he'd seen a woman in a business suit, someone we both recognized from the local HOA board, even though my ranch ISN and Oppos, part of their little suburban kingdom, out there at 5 in the morning with a mallet, pounding those signs into the dirt like she owned the rights to the horizon. Her name was Evelyn Thorne, the kind of woman who treats the entire county like it's her personal Pinterest board, and apparently she decided that my ranch gate was the, perfectly rustic, backdrop for her regional real estate showcase because the actual HOA clubhouse was having the floors waxed. Silas laughed and said, Jake, she's telling everyone the county gave her an easement through your north pasture to connect to the new development, And my heart just dropped because that was a lie so big it had to be a crime, an attempt to manifest a road through my life just because it looked good on a brochure. By noon, the quiet road outside my gate looked like a parking lot for a high-end mall, with cars lining the shoulder for a quarter mile. And then the, infrastructure, started arriving. A white van pulled up, and 2 guys started unloading a pop-up tent and a folding table right on the county right-of-way, acting like they had every right to be there. I walked out to meet them, my dogbuster at my side, and I asked the guy in charge for his permit. His eyes went wide when he realized I wasn't Oppos, one of the agents, and he fumbled with a clipboard, showing me a document that looked official but was missing the one thing that mattered, my signature. He told me Evelyn Thorne had authorized the setup, and when I told him Evelyn Thorne didn't Oppos, on the dirt he was standing on, he just looked at the crowd of agents starting to gather and said, Look, man, I just follow the app, and the app says we check in here, end quote. I realized then that the digital lie was stronger than the physical truth. People were looking at their screens and seeing a, end quote, community corridor, end quote, where there was actually a 40-year-old fence and a man telling them to go home, and that in Oppos. That's when I decided I wasn't in Oppos. Going to be the, end quote, grumpy old rancher, end quote. They expected I was going to be the one who shut the whole theater down. I called the non-emergency line, and while I waited for a deputy, I went to the barn, grabbed a piece of plywood and some black spray paint, and I wrote, end quote, private property, event. All trespassers will be prosecuted, end quote, in letters big enough to be seen from a low-flying plane. I wired that sign to the gate right in front of their check-in table, and you could hear the murmur of the crowd change from excited chatter to this low, hissing annoyance, like I was the one being unreasonable for wanting to keep my land to myself. Then, the locksmith arrived, a guy I've known for years, local fella named Miller, and he looked at me with this haunted expression, holding a work order that instructed him to, end quote, replace or bypass, end quote, the lock on my gate for, end quote, emergency access, end quote, related to the event. He told me the HOA had filed a claim saying the lock was a safety hazard for a public gathering, and I had to look him in the eye and say, end quote, Miller, if you touch that chain, I'm calling the sheriff for property damage and attempted break-in, and you know as well as I do that Evelyn Thorne has no authority here. End quote. He stepped back, hands up, relieved to have an excuse to walk away. But the crowd of realtors started getting vocal, one guy in a blazer shouting that they'd paid a registration fee for this, end quote, exclusive access, end quote, and that I was, end quote, obstructing commerce, end quote. That's when Evelyn Thorne finally made her entrance, rolling up in a black SUV that cost more than my last 3 tractors combined, and she stepped out like she was the governor visiting a disaster zone, binder tucked under her arm and a smile that didn't in Oppos to even try to reach her eyes. She walked straight up to me, ignoring the sign, ignoring the tension, and said, end quote, Jake, dear, let's not be difficult. We're bringing $300 million in potential listings through this corridor today, and it's going to do wonders for your property value if you just let us stage the check-in at the Oak Grove. End quote. I looked at her and said, end quote, Evelyn, there is no corridor, there's a pasture, and the only thing going through that gate today is my cattle, so you might want to tell your friends to move their cars before the county tow truck gets here. End quote. Her smile vanished, replaced by this cold, sharp-edged entitlement, and she whispered so only I could hear, end quote, I have a digital easement recorded in the regional planning draft. Jake, the world is moving on, and you can either be a part of it or get flattened by it. End quote. She actually thought a, end quote, planning draft, end quote, a suggestion on a map that had never been voted on or signed, gave her the right to cut my locks and march 100 people through my home. And that in Oppos. That's when I realized she'd been lying to her board, her sponsors, and every agent out there. She'd told them the ranch was a, end quote, partner site, end quote, and she'd even gone as far as to create a fake insurance certificate that listed the, end quote, Blackwood access point, end quote, as a covered area, but when Deputy Harris finally pulled up in his tan SUV, the whole house of cards started to wobble. Harris is a man of few words and even fewer smiles, and when I handed him my deed and the printouts of the forged, end quote, county consent, end quote, email Silas had helped me dig up from a public record search that morning, he didn't in Oppos to even look at Evelyn. He just looked at the tent and the table and told them they had 10 minutes to clear the right-of-way or he'd start writing citations for every car on the shoulder. Evelyn tried to play the, end quote, community leader, end quote, card, talking about regional growth and economic synergy, but Harris just pointed at my gate and said, end quote, ma'am, does your name say Blackwood? Because it does, and unless you have a court order signed by a judge, you're just a lady standing in the dirt with a lot of people who are about to get a very expensive parking ticket. End quote. The best part, the part that still makes me chuckle when I'm sitting out there at night, was when I pulled out my phone and showed the crowd the actual county GIS map. Not the doctored one Evelyn had sent out in her, end quote, info pack, end quote, but the real one, showing my property as a solid, unbroken block of private land with no easements, no corridors, and certainly no, end quote, Hilltop Horizon, end quote, road. The look on those agents in Oppos, Faces when they realized they'd been lured out to the middle of nowhere by a woman who'd lied to them just to hit her in quote. Engagement metrics in quote was something I'll never forget. It went from in quote, let us in quote, to in quote, give us our money back in quote, in about 30 seconds flat. Evelyn tried to scramble, her voice getting high and frantic as she tried to explain that it was and quote, visionary interpretation in quote, of the map, but the crowd was already folding their chairs and heading for their cars, realizing that their big networking event had just turned into a dusty roadside disaster. One of the younger agents, a guy who actually looked embarrassed, came up to me before he left and apologized, saying he'd been told this was and quote, community-supported initiative, in quote. And I just told him in quote, son, next time someone offers you a shortcut through a man and oppos. As life, ask yourself who and oppos, as paying for the bridge, in quote. But it didn't in oppos. T in there because Evelyn Thorne ISN and oppos. T the type to go down without trying to scorched earth the place. And a week later, I got a notice that the HOA was suing me for, in quote, tortious interference, in quote, with their business operations and for, in quote, maliciously obstructing a public interest project, in quote. They try to argue that because I'd once let the local 4-H club use the North Pasture for a calf show 5 years ago, I'd created and quote, prescriptive easement for public events, in quote, which is about as legally sound as saying that if I let you borrow my hammer once, you now own my house. I ended up having to hire a lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman who specialized in land rights, and we didn't in oppos. T just defend the suit. We countersued for fraud, defamation, and attempted trespassing, and we brought the in quote, fake in quote, insurance documents into the light of a courtroom where Evelyn's in quote, visionary interpretations in quote, were called what they actually were, forgery. The discovery process was a goldmine. We found emails where Evelyn told the board sheet in quote, handled the rancher in quote, and that the access was in quote, guaranteed in quote, all while she was secretly trying to pressure the County Planning Commission to retroactively approve the corridor to cover her tracks. The whole thing turned into a local scandal, the in quote, Battle of Blackwood Creek, in quote, and by the time it was over, Evelyn had been forced to resign from the HOA board. The real estate group had lost their sponsorship for the year, and I had a court-ordered permanent injunction that forbids any member of that HOA from even stepping foot on the county shoulder in front of my gate. I still see the yellow arrows sometimes in my dreams, that neon flash of entitlement. But when I wake up and look out the window, all I see is the tall grass blowing in the wind and the cattle grazing exactly where they're supposed to be. It makes you wonder, though, how many other people are out there right now, looking at a screen and thinking they have a right to someone else in oppos, as peace just because they've decided it's in quote, in the public interest, in quote. I'm curious, what would you have done if you walked out your front door and saw 100 people acting like your home was their stage? Do you think in quote, community and oppos, S needs in quote, should ever outweigh a person in oppos, S right to their own dirt, or have we reached a point where if it's on a map, it's as good as gone? Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to draw a line in the sand against people who think you're in quote. No in quote is just a suggestion because out here, offense ISN and oppos, T just wire and wood. It's the only thing that keeps the world from thinking everything is for sale.